Good afternoon and welcome to the Australian Disaster Resilience Conference presents Knowledge Week. My name is Amanda Leck and I'm the Executive Director of the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience. It is my absolute pleasure to have you joining us today for this virtual conference. When we began working on the program in October last year, we had planned to be at the Adelaide Convention Centre this week. However, COVID-19 had other plans. The AIDR team has demonstrated resilience in action by coping and adapting to the impacts of the pandemic with our programs transitioning to online delivery. 2020 has been a big year for us all, and I might say that interconnected and systemic risks such as that we've seen at play with COVID is certainly something that we will touch on at this conference over the coming days. I would like to extend a heartfelt thanks to the Conference Program Committee, who have been incredibly supportive of the move online and worked very hard with us to make this happen. And I would like to thank all of you for joining us online today for what I hope you will find as an insightful and thought-provoking week as our lineup of speakers share their knowledge and expertise with you. The transition to an online conference has meant that this program is able to be more inclusive, with many volunteers and community organisations receiving free sponsored places to attend. The overall theme of the conference this year is Disaster Risk Reduction in Action, Pathways to Success. Following the release of the National Disaster Risk Reduction Framework last year, it is more important than ever that we begin to have meaningful conversations about how we are going to take action that supports us to reduce disaster risk in Australia, and hear examples about how people are going about that in practice. We have an exciting program of speakers across the coming 4 days, as well as other special events, including the Australian Disaster Resilience Network Virtual Afternoon Tea, the launch of the Community Engagement for Disaster Resilience Handbook, and the National Dranson Forum. We've had close to 1,000 registrations across the various events during Knowledge Week and expect more than 200 people to be online with us at any one time. But before we go any further, we are very fortunate to be joined by Wurundjeri Elder, Uncle Colin Hunter Jr. for a welcome to country. Uncle Colin, may I invite you to begin?
Thank you. I'd like to start off by acknowledging that this afternoon we are meeting on the lands of my ancestors, the Wurundjeri people, and I'd like to take this opportunity to pay my respects to my elders, both past, present and emerging, elders from all nations, but I particularly want to pay my respects to everyone online today. Wominjeka welcome. Wurundjeri Balak, Yimin Kondi Bik. The Wurundjeri people welcome everyone to land today. Wurundjeri no Budumbo war Kondi Nagnak Dubin Big Bullock Paw Chilican. The Wurundjeri people want to look after and protect the land as they did long before. Wurundjeri country extends from the inner city of Melbourne. It goes across the mountains of the Great Dividing Range, west to the Werribee River, south to the Mordialloc Creek and east to Mount Baw Baw. And the Wurundjeri people are part of the Kulin Nation, another Wurrung language group. Hello, my name is Colin Hunter Jr. or Willert, meaning possum. A name given to me by my grandmother's young boy. I'm a proud and passionate 7th generation Wurundjeri man and a direct descendant of Bibijan, who was Nullangeta, or head of the tribe at time at first settlement. And it's through my grandmother, Gumbriar, meaning white dove, or only tiny or nanny she was known to us mob, that I got Aboriginal culture and heritage in my life today. So for that I say thanks, Nan. My grandmother was one of the last of the Aboriginal people born in the early 1920s, up at Corranderk Mission in Healesville, before she got pushed up the Barramon the River in New South Wales. In Aboriginal culture, a great deal of respect is given to the land, the plants and animals alike. And while you're on Wurundjeri country, you're most welcome to the traditional lands and the waterways of the Wurundjeri people. So Wominjeka, welcome. Enjoy the conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colin, for that wonderful welcome to country. And I'd also like to pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and for wherever you are in Australia or internationally today with us, and welcome you all to today's conference, the Australian Disaster Resilience Conference Presents Knowledge Week. We do have some brief housekeeping before we begin today. Many of you online ask us if our sessions are available, if they've been recorded, and they will all be recorded and will be made available on the Knowledge Hub, as well as the presentation slides from our various presenters. Online, you will also find the biographies and presentation outlines, the abstracts for the various sessions that you will hear speakers present over the next 4 days. And the AIDR team will be sharing a link to these in the chat window as we go on. We're trying to make the conference as engaging as possible in an online environment, and we have various special things lined up for you across the week. But we hope that you will also take the chance wherever you are sitting. If it's in Victoria, you are probably in your lounge room at home. But take the opportunity to get social, to share your conference experience on Twitter using the hashtag #ADRC20. We are also hosting a virtual poster display on Twitter, which will share a number of thought-leading ventures. Follow #ADRC20 and #ADRC posters to see the posters as they come through, and make sure to like, ask questions and retweet if you are a Twitter user. The AIDR team will also be sharing links with you so that you can view those posters. This conference will be using the Q&A feature on Zoom, and many of us have become far more familiar with Zoom in recent months. So if you'd like to ask a question, please post them into the Q&A box, not into the chat window. I can see many of you now, those saying hi from all parts of Australia, so it's lovely to have you all online with us today. You will be able to upvote those questions in the Q&A box by clicking the thumbs up button, and the session chairs will do their best to ask as many questions of speakers as we are able to get through. I encourage you, however, to use the chat window to share any thoughts or reflections during the presentations. And just a reminder that you will need to select all panellists and attendees in the drop-down menu for everyone attending today to be able to view your messages. It is now my absolute pleasure to be able to introduce Alice Hill to give our keynote address this afternoon. Alice has generously joined us from her home in Washington, where it must be very late on a Sunday evening, so we are very grateful. I had the great pleasure of attending an event in California last year where I met Alice and invited to join with us in Adelaide this year. Unfortunately, we've had to do it via Zoom, but nonetheless, we extend a very generous and heartfelt welcome to you, Alice. Alice Hill has an uncommon blend of experience as a federal prosecutor, judge, special assistant to the President, and senior director of the National Security Council. She currently serves as senior fellow for climate change policy at the Council on Foreign Relations, where she focuses on risks, consequences, and responses associated with climate change. While at the White House under President Obama, Alice led the development of the national policy to prepare for catastrophic risks, including climate change and biological threats. Alice previously served as a research fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Her co-authored book, Building a Resilient Tomorrow, was published by Oxford University Press. In 2020, Yale University awarded her the Public Voices Fellowship on the climate crisis. Over to you, Alice. Thank you.
Well, it's really my honor and pleasure to have a chance to speak with you all tonight. This is such an important conference. Amanda and her team have done such impressive work, and certainly we in the United States look up to Australia for the very fine work that you have done during your crises in the recent past. Unfortunately, here in the United States, you may have seen we are having some of the worst wildfires we've had in our history already. We've just determined as California continues to burn. More land has burned than the state of our state of Rhode Island, and we are still in the midst of our wildfire season. So we've had very dramatic events as we struggle with COVID. And certainly as we think about the topics that you'll be thinking about, it reminds us that going forward, we will need to be prepared for concurrent, consecutive, compounding risks. And that has real implications for emergency management. Emergency management, you know better than I do, are on the front lines. You're seeing it close up. And as we see more events occurring at once, it's proving that our old methods of doing things, where we assumed it would be one fire, one hurricane, one tropical cyclone, simply does not hold going forward. And that means that we need to look ahead and plan ahead and be better prepared. This year will be one for the history books. Across the globe, nations are struggling with the spread of the deadly coronavirus, and they're having varying levels of success. In my own country, it's a deep struggle. We do not yet have the disease contained. Our national government has stumbled badly, and we are trying to find our way out so that we are having fewer deaths and fewer cases of contagion. The disease revealed that some of the assumptions that we'd made about our needs were just not good assumptions. The disease has revealed that our medical stockpiles were inadequate. We lacked sufficient personal protective equipment, including masks, and we also had nowhere near enough ventilators. And our initial testing for the disease was just an utter failure. We had to pull it back. In the midst of this chaos, I spoke to a friend of mine who's been involved in emergency management for many years at the federal level. And in a moment of candor, he told me, you know, Alice, we just never imagined that we could have a disaster occurring everywhere in the country, in all 50 states at once. We just hadn't planned for it. What we also haven't planned for is that now we are living in the age of, as I've said, consecutive, concurrent, compounding disasters. And because the disasters are multiplying, it's going to cause us to need to rethink at a very fundamental level about how we do things. I joined the U.S. Department of Homeland Security in 2009 as senior counselor to the Secretary of Homeland Security. DHS is the third largest department in the United States. Only our Department of Defense and our Department of Veterans is larger. DHS, as it's known, the Department of Homeland Security, has over 200,000 employees. And of course, it was born out of the events of September 11th. It was the largest reorganization that our federal government has undertaken essentially since World War II. And it has a deep anti-terrorist focus, given its history. But it's also responsible for immigration, emergency management, guarding our borders, customs enforcement. Shortly after my arrival at the department, President Obama had issued an executive order requiring all federal agencies to engage in planning for climate change. And in those days, I can tell you, I don't think most people viewed climate change as something that would enhance their career, certainly not focusing on the issues. So as I recall, I was sitting around a conference table with a number of senior leaders in the Department of Homeland Security, and we're wondering, what should we do with this executive order? And it felt like somebody said, oh, give it to her, she's new. And that's how I ended up with the assignment of looking at how the Department of Homeland Security should adapt to climate change. And I didn't know much about climate change, so this task was a little daunting, but unfortunately we have scientists across the federal government who are deeply steeped in the science of climate change. We pulled together a task force that pulled together all these components contained within the department. And we asked ourselves the question in 2009, 2010, should this huge sprawling department with a large security focus even be planning for climate change? And our conclusion after we looked at the science was we needed to be deeply concerned about climate change, and yes, we should be planning now. So we wrote a number of forward-leaning reports signaling the risks to Homeland Security as well as national security from climate change. And as we worked through these issues, I became deeply concerned, as the other members of our task force did, that most policymakers, most leaders simply had not had the opportunity that we had to learn what's at stake with climate change. That it will fundamentally alter all of the systems upon which we rely: transportation, communications, public health, infrastructure, the electric grid. All of those systems that humans have been built on the assumption that the climate is stable, that it's not changing. But the climate is in fact changing, and it's changing quickly. Some scientists predict that in the next 50 years, we will see more change than we have in the last 6,000 years. And that will have profound consequences for keeping people safe, for responding to emergencies, and recovering from those disasters. So as we studied this issue and had our aha moment, realizing that it would affect everything, that the climate is no longer stable, that we are heating up, and we're heating up quickly, we began to appreciate that the heat will have consequences on the ground. California is living through that now. We've had just a period of extreme heat immediately before these fires, a period of drought, and we've had many lightning storms in California, not something typically experienced, and those lightning storms have ignited fires across the northern part of the state. It also means that we'll have more intense storms and, of course, sea level rise. And if we continue on our course, these events will happen perhaps in clusters, perhaps simultaneously, and that will deeply stress those responsible for ensuring that our countries, our cities, our communities remain safe. This year, the first named tropical storm for 2020 on the Atlantic Ocean formed in mid-May. Our hurricane season here on the East Coast doesn't begin until June 1st. It used to be unusual for tropical storms to form before June 1st, not anymore. For the 6th year in a row, tropical storms have formed before June 1st. We're already up to the letter M on the list of hurricane names. And of course, we're seeing California wildfires go from a season to almost an entire year of experiencing fire. We simply don't have enough firefighters right now available to handle the challenge. And of course, with the overlay of the coronavirus, that makes it difficult for the firefighters. It makes it very difficult for those evacuating. How do we keep them social distanced? Some people are afraid to leave because they're afraid of what they'll encounter in the shelters. And we are having a great deal of trouble in terms of containing these fires, simply because it's far more complex than even an ordinary large fire would be. The spokesperson for the California Fire Agency said he would refer to these fires as historic, but he and his team are tired of using that term, because with climate change, everything is historic. The worst storm that we just had may be not the worst storm going forward in all likelihood, it won't be. So I don't know how many times your media reports something like, oh, I've lived here, some person who's been in a disaster, I've lived here 30 years, I've never seen anything like this before. Well, that will be the story of every disaster, because by definition, climate change will bring us worsening events. The truth is that many events going forward will be record-breaking. That's what climate change does. And we need to start planning for that and incorporating those risks in all of our strategic planning, our operational planning, having the redundancy in systems, having the stronger mutual aid requirements. And I want to thank Australia for its help historically to us most recently. And I know that we lost some American firefighters during your Black Summer. But we're going to have to find ways to continue to help each other, even as we each suffer these events together. We could be facing, according to researchers in Princeton and MIT, hurricanes that just don't match the Saffir-Simpson hurricane scale that we currently have. They are talking about having a Category 6, just to recognize the higher wind speeds that we'll get. This summer, we saw in the Arctic Circle, in Siberia, above the Arctic Circle, temperatures over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And in Death Valley in California, I suppose very aptly named, this just a few days ago, we saw the highest recorded temperature ever believed to have occurred, or at least the third highest, 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Some of our major consulting companies have predicted that there'll be huge swaths of the globe that may become uninhabitable simply because of extreme temperatures. I recently saw a headline that said, the news is not climate change, it's the pace of climate change. And that's what our emergency managers are finding here in the United States. As soon as they respond to one event, they're called to another event. In 2017, Puerto Rico, a territory in the United States, an island about 1,000 miles off our coast, was hit by a Category 5 Hurricane Maria. Parts of the island lost power for over almost a year, the second largest power outage to ever occur. And our personnel, in our after action reports, it became clear. Many of them were exhausted from responding to prior events. We simply didn't have enough staff to be able to handle the types of events we were seeing. A large percentage of our staff at FEMA didn't even hold the qualifications for the job title that they had. And that greatly impacted our ability to have a good response and a good start to recovery for the people on Puerto Rico. And unfortunately, Puerto Rico not only has had to deal with COVID, it also has had an earthquake in the interim. This is the life ahead, and we need to figure out how we adjust to have better outcomes. So as we go forward, we need to appreciate that when multiple disasters occur within a geographic region or close in time, their impacts will affect how their governments cope. Even a rapid sequence of relatively modest weather events, or a cluster of them, may cause more damage than just a single large event. And if that occurs, it becomes more difficult for the communities to recover and be ready for the next extreme that may befall their community. We need to understand that failures of infrastructure can lead to disruptions of the most basic services like healthcare and transportation. Certainly COVID-19 has shown us how vulnerable our just-in-time supply chains are. We need to look at whether we need to be building greater caches of supplies, stockpiling food. We can do this on a national basis, but it's probably even more effective in some instances to do it on a regional basis, on the assumption that not everyone in the region will be suffering at the same time. We must brace ourselves as we go forward. We must accelerate our efforts that we started with the Sendai framework in 2015. That's very important work that established a way forward for all countries to have a better response system. I want to applaud Australia for its work in building its framework and building out the other documents necessary to have that support system for emergency management. Other nations have also begun the important work of enhancing their disaster management. But importantly, we still have a lot of work to do. 4 years after the historic Sendai meeting, the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction reported that efforts under the international framework had not achieved enough progress to reduce harm. International efforts remained, in their words, highly volatile, ex post, and marginal. But the United Nations estimates that less than $4 has been spent on risk reduction for every $100 spent on humanitarian aid. So we're still in a mode where we're responding with humanitarian aid rather than thinking, how can we be stronger? How can we be better prepared to withstand what is already hitting us and what will hit us in the future? In the wake of the pandemic, it's become clear that even where countries have drafted national strategies for disaster risk reduction, few have adequately considered risks like pandemics. We just haven't exercised our imaginations to encompass that which is unfamiliar. There are ways we know to do that. There's scenario testing. There's having exercises, sometimes tabletop, sometimes live exercises. But we need to find ways to encourage those who are making the decisions about emergency management to avoid the assumption that it can't happen here, to be too overly optimistic, and to not plan for what could be the unthinkable. Preparing now for a future filled with more frequent and intense extremes will save lives and it will save livelihoods, and it means that communities can bounce back much more quickly than they can if they're decimated, hit again and then again, if they have no insurance, if they have no stockpiles, if their emergency management help is exhausted and unable to respond. All of those things can hurt the long-term recovery of a community and of a nation. We need to help ensure that we bounce back quickly, that our communities remain stable, and that we keep the doors closed to bad actors. You know, COVID has revealed that in certain places of the world, bad actors have taken advantage of the situation. In Mexico, the Sinaloa cartel has taken pictures of El Chapo, one of the most famous leaders of the Sinaloa cartel, who is now incarcerated in the United States. His daughter stamped his picture on boxes of hand sanitizer, food, and passed them out to the community. Boko Haram has increased its criminal activity in the time of COVID as authorities struggle to deal with what's happening on the ground. An Italian mayor has complained that the mafia has used this as an opportunity to expand their influence. So it's important that we are able to help communities immediately to protect them, their safety, stop criminal elements from taking advantage of the situation, and continue to have communities feel safe and thrive. There's also an economic payback to this. The United Nations estimates that $1 spent on preparation will bring $4 in net benefits. My government estimates that that could be even higher. It could be $10 or more for every $1 we spend in risk reduction. So what are the steps specifically that we can take to have better results? First, we must find a way to move our investments in response, take some of that money to move it into risk reduction. The United States has just passed historic legislation that will probably result this year in about $500 million of money going to hazard mitigation. That's not enough, but that's more than we've ever historically given to communities to prepare themselves for worsening events. And if we can cut risk beforehand, we know that it will leave us more money in the bank to address other challenges. We also, in addition to investing in risk reduction, must invest more in emergency capabilities. That means creating workforces that can surge in these times of need. That could mean recruiting more volunteers from among ordinary citizens to help. And it could mean developing an entire workforce that will spring into action once that occurred. And we also need to find ways to work together to increase, as I said, our mutual aid, to invest in early warning systems that help people understand and to respond to these events. I know that you're working hard on that with your bushfires, trying to get more coordination across the entire nation so that everyone understands what a red code means. And we need to invest in redundancy. We need to make sure that it's not just in time, that we actually have more that we can call upon. So I want to say that we've learned a lot here in the United States, but we have a long road to go to be prepared for these kinds of things going forward. After the September 11th terrorist attacks occurred, we had a 9/11 commission, a commission to look at what went wrong. Their number one finding was that it was a failure of imagination that allowed terrorists to attack our nation. We simply never imagined that two planes could fly into two buildings in one of our greatest cities in the United States. So with that, I urge all of us to find ways to think ahead, plan ahead, be better, be stronger, because we are facing some very difficult times for the foreseeable future. We all are in this together. We need to help each other and learn from each other. And that's why this conference is so very exciting, because it's a real chance to do that. So I want to thank Amanda for having me here. I want to apologize for my tech problems, but I suppose this audience of all audience may be more accustomed to being nimble and resilient in the face of any kind of obstacle.
And thank you so much, Alice. And we really appreciate you joining us. We now have about 20 minutes with Alice, so I really encourage you to keep those questions coming in the Q&A box. You know, I think, Alice, you said some things that really resonated with me, the profound consequences for keeping people safe. No one works in emergency management or disaster risk reduction who doesn't have at their core of their being the desire to try to keep communities safe. So, as you said, it is beholden on all of us to do that. And the other thing that really resonated, having been to the 9/11 memorial myself, that notion of the failure of imagination. You know, it just was inconceivable that that could happen. But something else that was inconceivable, although we should have learned from history, 100 years ago, we experienced a global pandemic. So you've noted that when the pandemic struck us all at once as a global community, that it has actually given us a chance to experience catastrophic risk all together and to give us a sense of what climate change will mean for us. Would you like to elaborate on that a bit more? Because sometimes it is important to reflect on the silver linings of what this global pandemic has brought to us.
Yes, I think that's a critical point because, you know, with many of the disasters, be it an earthquake or a tropical storm or a drought, it's suffered by the individuals in that region, in that location. And there's not a wider understanding of what this can mean. And it certainly isn't retained in the greater memory of people as we go forward. But virtually everyone in the world has now suffered from a catastrophic risk. It's unveiled deep inequalities, certainly in my country, in the ability of our communities to respond to the needs of the most vulnerable and those who've been historically discriminated against. So as we look forward, can we take this experience that each of us have suffered, whether we're at home, whether we've been in extended lockdown, whether we haven't been able to travel, or we've had to curtail severely various activities. Many schools haven't opened. If we can take this experience and apply it to say, we need to do better. We need to be prepared in ways that it doesn't matter so much what this particular event looks like. Of course, there are individual needs to prepare, but we need to have a preparedness mindset. And that means we need to be willing to invest in what it takes to have what's at hand and have the personnel, the expertise, and the material goods to respond. So I think we can take advantage of this because certainly in the United States, many Americans tend in our polling to think, yes, climate change is happening, but it won't happen to me. And that makes it difficult for us to get people energized to think about how they could be better prepared. But we can take this experience and make it more real.
Thank you. So I'll take a question from our audience, which has received the most votes to date. You mentioned that compounding disasters have exposed our disaster preparedness and demonstrate a need to rethink how we respond. What practical action do you think governments, communities, and individuals can take now in order to be better prepared for simultaneous disasters? And how can we test the viability of our disaster response before disaster strikes?
Well, I think we start at the individual level. We need to make sure that individuals understand their risk and, of course, have their preparedness plan, understand what the warnings are. I think we need to do a much better job, certainly here in the United States, in closing the protection gap for insurance. We are way underinsured for seismic risk in California, huge seismic risk in that state, and it's less than 10% people carry earthquake insurance. I think we're going to have a problem after these wildfires with insurance coverage going forward. I know that you've had some of those challenges occasionally. So we need to think through how we're going to make sure that individuals are prepared. And then I think we need to figure out how we can have a surge workforce that is able to turn easily to help out. That would involve additional training. In the case of the United States, it's taking our federal workforce and making better use of them during these extreme events. It could also mean calling on our defense forces to help out civil authorities. There is some concern that could reduce our preparedness for a military conflict if we're constantly calling on our defense forces to prepare to respond to our national disasters, but we need to explore that. I think we can look for mutual aid on a regional basis, and we need to really support that in a more systematic way. It's been, in my research, it's appeared a bit ad hoc, and we've had some agreements reached, and then sometimes they're not really honored. So we need to figure out how can we ensure that occurs. And then we need to make sure that we're budgeting, figuring out what are the priority actions to fund for infrastructure, whether it's green infrastructure, wetlands, or whatever it is, to reduce the risk of a big storm, or it's making sure that we're not developing in areas at risk. That is, land use remains one of the biggest challenges I see, and that is very difficult for our local politicians here to really address. And in the United States, as I believe in Australia, many of those decisions are made on the local level. And so there's maybe a conflict in the wanting the tax base and other things, and please, elected officials want to please their constituents. But long-term, we need to look at land use and not develop in areas that we know either will burn again or will be flooded.
I might just take that opportunity, Alice, to mention the newly released Land Use Planning for Disaster Resilient Communities Handbook that AIDR only released a couple of weeks ago. So that gives a lot of principle-based advice to those working with local government, where often those decisions are taken about appropriate, land use. What advice do you have for those who are not necessarily in traditional leadership roles about what they can do so that they feel that they can also influence change?
I would say the most important thing is to talk about the risks. One of the things I found surprising when I worked in the White House was that in many of the meetings I was in, people weren't talking about the climate risk. And so if you're talking about sub-Saharan Africa, are we talking about the heat events they're going to have? If we're talking about Syria, are we talking about what the drought meant, a 1,200-year drought meant in terms of driving migration? It greatly surprised me that that was not part of the discussion, and I still find that as I'm in various discussions, people are surprised that we're having these worsening events. The scientists have been telling us this will happen. It's now unfolding. And I think that we need people to speak up, to say, what about climate change? Is this event predicted to occur again in even a worse way? What will that mean? And then I do think you had a question about exercise. I think it's very important that we are constantly trying to bring this to the forefront of leaders. When I was at the White House, we ran various scenarios for local communities so they could understand their risk. And I think we need to bring people into a room and start those discussions if they haven't started already. But as an individual, just to talk about it, I have to say, I think it's the most interesting, most challenging, but also the biggest topic, but the biggest opportunity for innovation, because no one knows really what to do. So any idea is worth discussing, and everyone can bring their ideas to see if we can find a better way forward.
Thank you. So we have chatted about this, but this year, just in March of this year, all of our Australian governments endorsed the disaster risk reduction, which is Australia's response to Sendai. So that is very encouraging, and funding has been now allocated toward implementation of the disaster risk reduction framework. So we're all looking forward to seeing, where governments are putting those priorities. And it's also great to hear that the US is putting forward more funding towards hazard mitigation. Yes. So how are decision makers going to determine where to allocate that funding to?
Well, that's the toughest question of all, isn't it? Prioritizing the spending. We just had a report come out from one of our watchdogs for the federal government that has been sounding the alarm on climate change, saying that climate change could be a huge risk to the financial health of the federal government. So you can imagine the financial health of the United States government, if it's a risk to that, it's a very big risk. And one of their criticisms is that we don't prioritize within the federal government the money that we currently spend. So it's sort of one-off projects, it's smaller projects, and their analysis was it's not a very effective approach. So I think that is an example of how we need to rethink how we do business, because we're going to have to make some hard choices. If we just do little projects here and there and don't step back and say, is this really going to help keep us safer? We will have squandered a lot of money and then be even more vulnerable than we started. And we see this a lot, particularly with coastal erosion and not investing in wetlands and other green infrastructure now that needs to be invested in to give it enough time to grow and be in place to provide a better buffer. But we keep pushing it down the road saying we'll do it later, or we're thinking about hardening, building really big hard structures that are very expensive, but may just be overtopped by sea level rise in 50 years. So that's the hardest question of all. And we're going to have to find ways to rank our projects and really prioritize them in a meaningful way, at least here in this country.
So something probably a little bit more practical in nature. You spoke about the issue of, evacuations that you're now seeing in California. So moving people into evacuation shelters with risks associated with COVID. What are some of the strategies that are being employed in the US sort of as we speak now to deal with this issue?
Well, before hurricane season started, certainly we were, our Federal Emergency Management Agency was working with communities, trying to talk to them about evacuation centers. Unfortunately, because the demands of COVID and having to have places, temporary hospitals in place, some of those temporary hospitals ended up being in high hazard areas for flooding. So that's a concern if a hurricane, and we're having this very active hurricane season, were to hit. As for the evacuations from here in the wildfires, I think we've been looking at alternatives, putting people into hotels, trying to find other ways for them to be socially distanced successfully. And it's, from the reports in the media, it's just a very difficult situation to try to get this done calmly and well, because the wildfires are so large and there have been so many strikes by lightning, igniting many fires. So this is going to be a real challenge. I don't have the answers now. Certainly there was a lot of planning. In California and in some places in the West, they decided to do fewer prescribed burns because they didn't want to put, have to have firefighters together because they might contract COVID. There's been more thought about how the firefighters are housed during the fires, what kind of camps there are, and there's been, because of the social distancing, they've had fewer firefighters on a number of these lines, according to media reports. So all of it has made everything more complex. And I do want to say that I think that our emergency managers have been thinking about these issues, trying to address them. It's just a very difficult thing to do. And we didn't have as much time to plan as probably we all would have hoped for. Which gets back to, if we started thinking that what if we have multiple events and how could we be better prepared, it would be probably have better outcomes. I would say that one of our presidents said, plans are useless, but planning is essential. So I'm not suggesting that every plan we make would work out, but I do think that just the essence of planning or having that process improves people's thinking, relationships, and ideas for how to be better prepared.
Well, we only have a few minutes left, and I think, Alice, you and I could talk about these issues for most of the afternoon or your night. But how do you think we can build the case for the economics of building disaster resilience? There seems to be a perception that we can spend on the economy or we can spend on preventing disasters, and that they're somehow fundamentally different. But as we come out of COVID-19, and we know governments all over the Western world are going to be investing in their economies to try and, you know, breathe new life back into economies, how do we convince governments that there is an economic case for building for disaster resilience?
Well, I think our recoveries could take into account these different requirements. I mean, there are jobs to be had if you're going to be building infrastructure, green infrastructure, gray infrastructure that's more resilient. Right now, we're not really engaged in that. I think it could be a job, certainly a job opportunity, and should be part of any economic recovery going forward. Just as I believe that cutting emissions should be a part of any recovery going forward. And we've seen in Europe more attention to this concept than certainly we've seen in the United States. That has not been a part of our recovery, but I hope that as we all consider these issues, we think through and make sure that our economic recovery leads us in a better place. That's kind of the function of what we hope all of those involved in these issues. That's what we all hope, is that it will be better as a result of what we do. And I think this is an opportunity to have that happen.
Well, unfortunately, that's all we've got time for today, Alice. So I'm going to have to draw this session to a close, but we're all very much clapping in the background for you. So thank you so much for your insights. I would encourage people again, if they'd like to read your writings, you do have a website. We'll put that in the link again. I noticed the piece you wrote about FEMA that you published on LinkedIn just, I think it was on Friday last week. So you've written extensively on this topic of climate change, disaster risk reduction and resilience and emergency management. So thank you so much for joining us in what is a very late Sunday night for you. We'll just have a minute or so break, and then we'll get straight into the sessions for this afternoon. Thank you so much, Alice.